An old woman helped a homeless man despite the villagers' ridicule. No one expected that a few days later, he would do something that would deeply hurt the old woman. In the small, peaceful town of Cooperstown, where life seemed to flow as gently as a whisper carried on the breeze, lived Mrs. Heather. At 70 years old, her life reflected years of hard work and kindness. Since her husband had passed away over a decade ago, Heather had grown used to living alone. Her days were spent tending to her garden, where she grew herbs and vegetables to sell at the local market. Though her children, Mike and Sandra, had moved to the city in search of better opportunities, Heather bore them no resentment. Still, every time she checked her mailbox and found it empty, her heart ached with a silence heavier than words. One hot afternoon, after a tough day at the market where sales were sparse, Heather walked through the town square. Under the shade of an old tree, she noticed a man sitting on the ground. His clothes were worn, and his calloused hands held a battered hat. The townspeople called him James, a drifter who had arrived in Cooperstown weeks earlier. While most avoided making eye contact with him, Heather saw something different in his gaze, a mix of sorrow and quiet endurance that seemed to speak of untold hardships. "Good afternoon, sir," she greeted him warmly, her smile softening the weight of the moment. "Would you like some water and bread?" James looked up, startled by her offer. Heather's kindness felt almost surreal in a town where whispers often drowned out acts of compassion. "Thank you, ma'am," he replied with a trembling voice, accepting her gesture. Heather sat beside him on the edge of a stone bench, ignoring the curious stares of passers-by. As they shared the bread, Heather asked for his name and how he'd ended up in town. James responded humbly, though his answers were vague and his story incomplete. He mentioned losing everything in a fire, but avoided details about his family or past. Before leaving, Heather promised to bring more food the next day. "Thank you, ma'am," James said again, a faint smile crossing his face. "I don't know how to repay your kindness." "Don't worry about it," Heather replied. "Everyone requires assistance at some point in their lives." As Heather walked home, the sky turned a warm orange with the fading daylight. Neighbors watched her from their doorsteps, their expressions filled with disapproval. Betty, her neighbor and friend, shook her head from her window, murmuring words Heather couldn't catch. But Heather didn't care. Something in her heart told her helping James was the right thing to do. That night, as she made tortillas in her small kitchen, James's words echoed in her mind. Why had someone like him, with eyes that reflected intelligence and strength, ended up on the streets? Heather had doubts about his story, but she overcame them. Perhaps this was a test of her faith, she thought, or simply an opportunity to prove that goodness still existed in the world. Heather was unaware that this chance meeting would trigger an irreversible transformation in her life. While the town's murmurs grew louder, an unexpected truth was beginning to unfold in the shadows of Cooperstown, waiting to come to light when no one anticipated it. When Heather returned to the square the following day with a plate of rice and beans for James, the town had already become enthralled with her kind gesture. The whispers started early. From Betty's diner to Mr. Harold's corner store, people couldn't stop speculating. Why would a woman like Heather waste her time helping someone like him? Some questioned. Others, more cynical, wondered if James might be taking advantage of her kindness. That very afternoon, Betty, Heather's longtime neighbor and close friend, decided to pay her a visit. She knocked on the wooden door with her familiar blend of urgency and purpose. Heather greeted her with a warm smile, but Betty entered wearing a serious expression. "Heather, we need to talk," she said, settling at the kitchen table as the comforting scent of freshly brewed coffee filled the air. Heather poured 2 cups and sat across from her friend. "What's on your mind, Betty?" she asked, already sensing where the conversation was headed. Betty took a sip of coffee, clearly choosing her words carefully before replying. "That man, James. People are talking. They're saying it's not safe to help a stranger like that. What do we really know about him? You never know who someone truly is, Heather. Heather sighed softly, but remained composed. Betty, all I know is that he's hungry and needs help. That should be reason enough for anyone, she responded calmly. But Betty pressed on, her voice firm. What if he has bad intentions? Look, I'm not saying you're wrong to be kind. Far from it. But kindness can be dangerous if given to the wrong person. Betty's words echoed the judgment Heather had already encountered earlier that day at Mr. Harold's store. While buying some household essentials, the shopkeeper had made a pointed remark, loud enough for her to hear. Those drifters never show up without a reason. He's probably after something and it's not work, he said, stacking cans on the shelf. Heather had chosen not to respond, though the weight of being scrutinized for her choices lingered with her. Now facing Betty, she felt the need to defend herself. Betty, I understand your concerns, but we can't judge someone based on appearances or the little we know about their life. What kind of people would we be if we turned our backs on someone in need? Betty sat quietly, studying her friend's face, which showed equal parts determination and weariness. Finally, Betty sighed and dropped the subject, though not without leaving a parting caution. Just be careful, Heather. That's all I'm asking. In the days that followed, Heather continued to visit James in the plaza. Each time, she brought something different: hot soup, freshly baked bread, or fruit from her garden. During their meetings, they talked a little more each time. Heather's warmth and patience encouraged James to share fragments of his past. He mentioned that he had spent his entire life working as a carpenter until a fire destroyed his workshop and left him with nothing. But when Heather gently asked about his family, James deflected the question. One afternoon, while gazing at the horizon, he simply said, "I have no one. Life took everything from me." Heather felt a pang of sadness for him, but there was something off about the way he said it. His tone carried a chill, like he was reciting a story rather than reliving a memory. She decided not to push further, but couldn't help the growing doubts creeping into her mind. One morning, while Heather was carrying a food container to the town square, she passed Mr. Harold sweeping the front of his shop. "Are you still feeding that man?" he asked, his voice laced with disbelief. "Yes, Mr. Harold, he needs it," Heather replied, without breaking stride. Mr. Harold paused, setting his broom aside, and watched her walk away. "Nothing in this life is free, Heather. Be careful. Some people don't know how to be grateful," he called after her. Heather kept walking, but Mr. Harold's words joined the whispers and judgmental glances that had been swirling through the town. That night, as she sat weaving by the dim glow of a lamp, her mind replayed her conversations with James. His story didn't quite fit together. If he had truly lost everything, why didn't he seem emotionally scarred when talking about his workshop or his supposedly lost family? And why did his gaze sometimes seem calculating, as if carefully choosing each word? Despite her growing doubts, Heather couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to James's story, something deeper, perhaps buried under fear or shame. But what could be so significant that it left him in this state of isolation? The town's murmurs continued, and every time Heather left her house, she felt the weight of her neighbors' prying eyes. Even so, she refused to let their judgment dictate her actions. One evening, as she returned from her daily trip to the square, she stopped in front of her house and gazed at the horizon. She knew her decision to help James wasn't popular, but she also knew that surrendering to others' judgments would cost her something far greater: her humanity. Yet as she lay in bed that night, struggling to fall asleep, the doubts crept back in. What if the townsfolk were right? What if James wasn't who he claimed to be? The uncertainty, like a quiet shadow, began to settle in her heart. Mornings in Cooperstown carried a calm that masked the secrets of its residents. For Heather, these hours marked the start of her routine, which now included daily visits to James. Their conversations grew longer and more personal with each encounter under the sprawling tree in the square, as though a fragile bridge of trust was beginning to form between them. "I had a tough childhood, you know," James said one afternoon, crumbling a piece of bread Heather had brought him. "My father was a farmer, and we didn't have much to eat. I learned to work young." Heather listened silently, sensing there was more behind his words than he was willing to reveal. He recounted his arduous days in the fields, chilly nights spent under a leaking roof, and his decision as a young man to pursue a better life in the city. Yet when the conversation turned to recent events, his words grew vague. "What about your family?" Heather asked gently, careful not to seem intrusive. "Isn't there anyone looking for you or waiting for you?" James averted his eyes, fixing them on some far-off point on the horizon. For a few moments, he seemed to be gathering his thoughts. "There's no one left," he finally said, his voice tinged with a melancholy that felt almost rehearsed. "Life took everything from me." Heather noticed his hands trembling slightly as he held the plate of food she had brought him. Those words seemed to weigh more heavily on him than he was willing to admit. Though his tone was convincing, there was something in his eyes that didn't sit right, a faint shadow of calculation that sparked a flicker of distrust in Heather. Despite this, Heather refrained from pressing him, trusting that he would reveal himself on his own terms. As the days went by, James's stories began to feel like fractured reflections of a life that had once held meaning. In turn, Heather found herself opening up, as though her own memories resonated with his confessions. One afternoon, after James shared the story of losing his workshop in a fire, Heather revealed a deeply buried part of her own past. Heather's voice softened, and her eyes glistened with unshed tears as she began to speak. "I've also lost something dear to me," she said. "My husband, Gabriel, died in an accident when my children were still little. That was the darkest day of my life." James's expression shifted as he listened, surprised by the vulnerability Heather was showing. He didn't say anything, but his gaze invited her to go on. "Mike and Sandra were my only reason to keep going," she continued. "I worked tirelessly day and night to give them what they needed. Even when it wasn't much, there were days I went without eating just to make sure they had enough." Heather paused, drawing a deep breath as though it might ease the heaviness in her chest. "Now, they live in the city," she added. "They've built their own lives there, and I'm happy for them. But sometimes—" Her voice faltered before she finished. "Sometimes, I wonder if they remember everything we went through together to get here." James nodded slowly, his silence filled with an empathetic understanding. Though he didn't speak right away, his face reflected a blend of compassion and something harder to pinpoint, as though Heather's words stirred memories he'd rather leave buried. "Raising children alone is never easy," he finally said, his tone gentler than usual. "But they always come to understand the sacrifices, sooner or later." Heather offered him a faint, sad smile. She yearned for her children to comprehend the extent of her sacrifices for them, yet their infrequent visits and diminishing correspondence only exacerbated a wound that never fully healed. Though her talks with James brought a kind of emotional comfort, they also made her feelings of abandonment sharper. One evening, while tending to her garden, Heather remembered a letter Mike had sent months earlier. In it, he wrote about being overwhelmed with work and promised to visit soon. But that soon had yet to come. Heather knew her children were busy with their own lives and responsibilities, yet she couldn't help but wonder if she'd done something wrong, something that pushed them away. That night, as she stitched a handkerchief under the glow of her lamp, her thoughts wavered between cherished memories and doubts about James. His stories felt sincere, yet they were full of gaps. Why did he speak so vividly about his childhood, but avoid talking about his present? Was it shame? Or was there something else he wasn't saying? Despite her suspicions, Heather couldn't deny the bond she felt with him. There was something about his vulnerability, the way his words mirrored a pain she also carried, that made her want to keep helping him. Still, her doubts lingered like tiny pebbles in her shoes, not painful enough to stop her, but ever present, reminding her that not everything was as straightforward as it seemed. The following day, Heather made the decision to trust her intuition, if only temporarily. Carrying a basket of tamales, she headed to the plaza. When she arrived, she found James sitting in his usual spot, staring into the distance. This time, though, his gaze seemed more introspective, as if he was wrestling with his own thoughts. "Good morning, Mr. James." Heather greeted him with a warm smile. "I brought you some bean tamales today. I hope you like them." "Thank you, Mrs. Heather," he replied, grabbing one of the tamales and taking a hungry bite. As he ate, Heather noticed a glimmer in his eyes, a subtle hint of something he seemed reluctant to share. She tried to push the thought aside, but the feeling lingered, an intuition that Mr. James was hiding something. The quiet mystery grew, tugging at her curiosity. It was a Saturday morning, when an unexpected noise broke the stillness of the town. The sound of a car startled Heather, who turned to see an old sedan pulling up outside her house. From her kitchen window, she watched Mike step out, followed by his 2 children. His walk was firm, his expression serious, while Sandra followed with a tentative smile, masking her nerves. Heather placed her apron on the table and stepped outside, her heart pounding with an unshakable feeling of unease. "Mike, Sandra!" she exclaimed, her voice laced with surprise. "What a pleasant surprise! I wasn't expecting you." Mike, 45, responded with a stiff hug, while Sandra, 42, leaned in to kiss her mother's cheek with warmth. "Mom," Mike said, his tone carrying a protective edge Heather recognized from his childhood, but now felt almost like a rebuke. "We need to talk to you." Heather invited them inside, but before she could serve them coffee, Mike addressed them directly. "We've heard things, Mom. People are saying you're helping a homeless man." Heather looked up, startled by her son's bluntness. "Yes, that's true," she said calmly. "His name is Mr. James. He's a man in need, and I don't see why I shouldn't help him." Mike frowned, crossing his arms. "But what do you actually know about him? He could be dangerous. What if he's just taking advantage of you? It's not safe to get involved with someone like that." "Mike, please," Sandra interjected, her tone attempting to soften the conversation. "Mum, we just want to make sure you're okay. We understand that you want to help, but we don't know who this man is." Mike might have a point. Heather's heart ached at their mistrust. Their doubt in her judgment stung deeply. She placed her hands in her lap, took a deep breath, and replied with steady emotion. "You know how much I care for both of you," she said, her voice firm yet heartfelt. "I raised you to never judge people based on their appearance, or what little you know about them. Why would you think I'd act recklessly now?" Mike shook his head in frustration. "This isn't about judging, Mum. It's about common sense. You can't just trust someone you barely know." "It's not blind trust, Mike," Heather shot back, her voice rising for the first time. "It's humanity. That man has no one, and if I can help him, I will." Sandra, uncomfortable with the escalating tension, tried to mediate. "Mum, we understand your kindness, but you need to think about yourself too. We just don't want you to get hurt." Though Sandra's words carried care, Heather couldn't help but feel her children were questioning her ability to make her own decisions. "Hurt?" Heather replied, with a bitter smile. "You talk about protecting me, but you're not even here to see how I truly live. You only show up when there's gossip or when something bothers you." She paused, her gaze steady. "I'm not asking you to agree with my decision. I'm asking you to respect it." Mike opened his mouth to argue, but Sandra stopped him with a hand on his arm. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with unspoken tension, and Heather took the opportunity to step away from the table to pour herself the coffee she had forgotten to serve. As she moved, her mind swirled with a mix of sadness and frustration. She had hoped her children would show some support, or, at the very least, a little faith in her. But instead, she felt like they were treating her as if she were a child incapable of managing her own life. When she returned to the table, Mike looked at her, his expression a blend of concern and stubbornness. "Mum, this isn't just about us. People in town are talking, and we don't want you to be seen as—" He paused, searching for the right words. "As what, Mike?" Heather interrupted, locking her gaze on him. "As an old woman who's lost her mind. Someone who doesn't deserve respect for helping another human being." Mike had no response. Sandra, however, reached out and held her mother's hand gently. "We just want you to be okay, Mom. That's all." Heather pulled her hand away softly and stood up. "I am okay, Sandra. What hurts isn't what the town says. It's that my own children don't trust me." Silence took over the room again, and this time Mike stood. "Maybe we should leave," he said, glancing at Sandra. Sandra nodded sadly, but before leaving, she hugged her mother tightly. "Please, take care of yourself, Mum. We love you." Heather didn't respond. She just watched as her children left, taking with them the happiness she had felt when they first arrived. When the sound of their car faded into the distance, Heather was left alone in the living room, her heart heavy and her eyes wet with unshed tears. That night, while knitting in her room, Heather replayed her children's words over and over. Though she understood their intentions came from a good place, she couldn't ignore the emptiness they left behind. For the first time, she began to wonder if they might be right. Did she truly know James? Had her kindness blinded her to something she didn't want to see? But then, she remembered their conversations, the stories he had shared, his voice heavy with pain. She couldn't dismiss the bond they had formed. However, doubt had already taken root. As the moon cast its faint light across the room, Heather couldn't shake the feeling that something larger was at play, something that would change her life, and James's forever. The afternoon in Cooperstown had started quietly, with the sun hiding behind grey clouds that hinted at rain. Heather, seated by the window, watched the sky with unease. Storms in the town were unpredictable. While they rarely caused major damage, she couldn't stop worrying about James, who often sought shelter under the old oak tree in the square. The thought of him out in the open with nothing but his worn-out hat for protection gnawed at her. As the wind picked up and distant thunder rumbled, Heather decided to light the kerosene lamp before darkness completely enveloped her home. Outside, raindrops began to fall. Slowly at first, then with such force it was hard to hear anything else. By the time the clock struck 8, Heather couldn't hold back any longer. She grabbed her umbrella and a woolen shawl and stepped out into the downpour. The cold rain stung her face, and her sandals slipped on the muddy ground, but she pressed on. She walked straight to the square, hoping to find James. And when she arrived, she saw him. He was huddled under a makeshift shelter, crafted from cardboard and a tattered tarp, his arms crossed tightly over his chest in a desperate attempt to stay warm. His hat was soaked through, and water dripped steadily from his grey hair. Seeing him like this, Heather felt her chest tighten. "James!" she called out as she approached. The man looked up, startled to see her standing there. "Mrs. Heather, "What are you doing out here in this storm?" he asked, his voice trembling. "I can't leave you out here like this. Come with me to my house. It's nothing fancy, but at least it's warm and dry," Heather insisted. James hesitated, pride flickering across his face as though it might prevent him from accepting her help. But the bitter cold was relentless, and after a brief pause, he nodded. Heather gently helped him to his feet and guided him toward her home. Once inside, she led him to sit by the fireplace, which she quickly kindled into a roaring blaze. The flames danced along the walls, casting warm, flickering shadows across the room. James, still shivering, removed his drenched hat and shoes, while Heather disappeared into the kitchen. Moments later, she returned with a steaming bowl of soup. "Here, take this," she said, placing it into his hands. "It'll help warm you up." He muttered a quiet thank you and began eating slowly. From her chair, Heather watched him, noticing how fragile he seemed in the glow of the firelight. After a moment, she stood and fetched a blanket she had knitted years ago, back when her hands were still free of arthritis. Draping it over his shoulders, she noticed the look in his eyes, a mix of gratitude and something deeper, something she couldn't quite place. "This is too much, Mrs. Heather. I don't even know how to thank you for all of this," he said, wrapping himself in the blanket. "Don't worry about it, James. In this life, helping one another is the only thing that truly matters," she replied. Outside, the storm continued to rage, the wind howling against the windows and filling the silences between them. After finishing his soup, James began to talk, as if the warmth had loosened his tongue. "You know, I didn't always live like this. I used to have a home, a job, a family. But it all vanished overnight." Heather listened intently, her eyes scanning the lines etched into his face. Each wrinkle conveyed a profound narrative, surpassing the depths of his spoken words. "What happened, James?" she asked softly. He looked down at his empty bowl, his gaze heavy with memories too painful to share. "I lost everything in a fire. My workshop, my house. Nothing was left," he said. Heather nodded, but something about his tone struck her as oddly rehearsed. It was the same explanation he'd given when they'd spoken in the plaza weeks ago. Deciding to press gently, she asked, "And your family? Where were they?" James looked up briefly, his eyes darting away from hers. "They weren't with me," he said, after an awkward pause. "It's better if we don't talk about that." Heather's heart ached at his words. She could see the heavy burden he carried, but also noticed how carefully he sidestepped certain questions. For a moment, she questioned everything he'd told her. But then, she remembered nights when she too had felt the same emptiness and sorrow she now saw in him. How could she judge him without knowing his full story? Choosing to change the subject, she offered a comforting smile. "Well, at least tonight you'll stay warm. Tomorrow, when the storm clears, we'll figure out how to fix up your shelter," she said reassuringly. James nodded, though his gaze remained fixed on some distant point beyond the fire. The storm raged on through the night, but within Heather's small home, a strange sense of calm settled in. As James drifted off to sleep, wrapped snugly in the blanket, Heather stayed awake, knitting and reflecting. What secrets was he hiding? And why did she feel such a profound connection to him, despite the uncertainties? When the first light of dawn broke through the clouds, Heather made a decision. Even if she didn't know the whole truth, she would trust her instincts. In a world so full of doubt, kindness couldn't wait for certainty. Still, Heather couldn't shake the feeling that there was something mysterious about James, something hidden that seemed closer to being unveiled with each passing day. Life in the small town of Cooperstown was slowly returning to normal after the storm, even though puddles still lingered on the dirt roads and broken branches lay scattered along the streets. In the days that followed, Heather spent her time helping James patch up his makeshift shelter in the town square, but her mind buzzed with unanswered questions. Every time she tried to learn more about his past, he skillfully changed the subject, as if his memories were off-limits. One morning, while Heather was picking up some vegetables at the market, a sleek black car rolled to a stop outside Betty's diner. Out stepped a tall man with perfectly groomed hair and an immaculate suit that starkly contrasted with the simplicity of the town. He carried a leather briefcase and radiated confidence. Soon he became the focal point of the town, with curious townsfolk peeking out from windows and doorways. "Now who could that be?" murmured Betty as she wiped her hands on her apron. "He doesn't look like he's from around here." Heather noticed him too, but at first she didn't think much of it. Still, there was something about his confident demeanor that felt odd. The man introduced himself as Jackson and seemed to be looking for someone, though he kept the details to himself. His polite yet reserved manner sparked all sorts of speculation among the locals. "Probably a government inspector or something," suggested Mr. Harold as he polished the counter at his store. "Doesn't seem like he's here for pleasure." Jackson walked purposefully through the town, his steps deliberate, until he finally arrived at the main square. Under the faded awning, he found James sitting in his usual spot. Heather, only a few feet away selling herbs, couldn't help but watch their interaction. Jackson approached James with a look that was both serious and slightly irritated. When James saw him, he froze for a brief moment. Heather immediately noticed an unusual flicker of discomfort cross his face, something she had never seen before in the man who always seemed unbothered, regardless of the situation. "Hector," Jackson said softly, leaning toward him, "we're running out of time. This needs to be finished soon." Heather overheard bits of their conversation, though the words didn't make sense to her. Victor? Why was he calling James that? James replied in a low voice. Heather couldn't discern his tone, but it was firm, as if he was resisting pressure. Jackson studied him with a mix of frustration and disapproval before straightening his suit and walking away. Heather stayed rooted in place, trying to make sense of what she had just witnessed. When Jackson passed her, he gave her a brief, assessing look. "Good morning, Mum," he said, with a slight nod, his voice smooth and deliberate. Heather nodded back, but couldn't shake a feeling of unease. Something about him evoked a sense of a brewing storm, poised to explode at any moment. That evening, as Heather prepared dinner, the scene replayed in her mind. She resolved to ask James about it the next day. When she found him in the square, he seemed quieter than usual, as if carrying some unseen burden. "James," Heather began cautiously, "yesterday I saw you talking to that man. Jackson, I think he said his name was. Do you know him?" James slowly lifted his gaze, seeming to search for the right response. After a moment, he shook his head and said, "Just someone passing through. It's nothing important." Heather studied him skeptically. She knew he wasn't telling her the whole truth, but decided not to push him further. Still, a seed of doubt began to grow inside her. Who was this man to James? And why had he called him Christian? Was it possible that everything she thought she knew about him was a lie? Meanwhile, Jackson, staying at the small inn in town, kept asking indirect questions about James to the locals. Though he never shared his true intentions, his presence was starting to stir rumors. "That man knows something about James." "I'm sure of it," Betty said to Heather one afternoon as they sipped coffee in the kitchen. "Could he be a relative?" Mr. Harold suggested, passing by to drop off some supplies. "If he is, why not say it outright?" Heather remained silent. Part of her wanted to trust James and the bond they had built, but Jackson's actions and the inconsistencies in James's stories were making her instincts louder than ever. That evening, Jackson met James again in a secluded corner of the town square. "Christian, this has gone on long enough," Jackson said firmly. "We can't keep delaying this. If you won't act, I will. Let me choose the right moment, James replied, with a newfound resolve in his tone. The moment has passed, Christian. Every day you wait makes you more vulnerable. This isn't just about you. It affects everyone involved. The conversation was brief but charged with intensity, leaving no doubt that something significant was at stake. James, also known as Christian by Jackson, appeared torn between two paths, burdened by an internal conflict. From her living room window, Heather saw James returning to his modest home, shoulders slumped and eyes fixed on the ground. Something much bigger was unfolding, threatening to upend everything she believed to be true. For the first time, she began to question whether placing her trust in him had been a mistake. Storm clouds of hidden truths loomed in the distance, ready to break. The night in Cooperstown was calm, but Christian Warren, known to the townsfolk as James, found no peace. Sitting beneath the lamppost in the town square, draped in the shawl Heather had given him, his mind raced. He had arrived in the town weeks ago with a clear purpose: to test the kindness and humanity of strangers without revealing his true identity as a wealthy entrepreneur. What Christian hadn't expected was the profound effect Heather would have on him. She hadn't just helped him. She had done so without expecting anything in return, standing up to the judgment of her neighbors, and even more painfully, her own family. Her kindness had disarmed him in ways that no amount of wealth or business success ever could. Yet now, that very kindness felt like a crushing weight. With each passing day that he kept his secret, his fear of losing the bond they had formed grew stronger. Christian sighed deeply, clenching his fists. He knew he had to tell Heather the truth, but every time he imagined her reaction, her face when she discovered his lie, a sharp pang of guilt stopped him. How could he look her in the eye and admit that all of this had started as an experiment? What if she saw him as a manipulator, someone who had taken advantage of her compassion? The thought haunted him. Meanwhile, Heather was equally restless. Her children's words, the neighbors' judgmental stares, and now Jackson's mysterious actions swirled together in her mind, leaving her with an uneasy sense that everything was about to change. Heather had stood up for James against everyone, firmly believing her instincts were right. But now, doubts were creeping in. As she sat in her living room, weaving, memories of their conversations played over in her mind. She recalled how he seemed to sidestep questions about his family and chose his words carefully when talking about his past. With Jackson's recent arrival and the inconsistencies she had started to notice, Heather began to wonder if she had been too trusting. Still, she couldn't deny the genuine connection she felt with James. Her heart told her that behind his silence was a man carrying deep wounds. The days that followed were filled with an unspoken tension between them. Christian, increasingly aware of the need to come clean about his identity, started acting more distant, avoiding prolonged conversations with Heather. She noticed the change, but couldn't decide if it was a sign of detachment or simply fatigue. One afternoon, as Christian was working on repairs to his shelter, Heather approached him with a basket of fruit. "James, you've been unusually quiet lately. Is everything okay?" she asked, her concern evident in her gaze. Christian looked at her for a moment, torn about whether to confess then and there, but he eventually looked away. "Yes, Mrs. Heather. I'm just a bit tired, that's all," he replied. Heather sensed something was off, but decided not to press further. She stayed for a while, sitting silently nearby, hoping her presence might provide some comfort for whatever he was facing. That evening, Christian resolved to speak with Jackson. He found him at the inn, reviewing some documents in his room. "I can't keep this up anymore," Christian said, closing the door firmly behind him. Jackson looked up, his expression serious but unsurprised. "I warned you this wouldn't be easy, Christian. If Heather is as special as you say, she'll understand, Jackson replied. You don't get it, Christian shot back, running a hand through his hair in frustration. It's not just about Heather. It's everything. This place, these people. They've shown me how empty my life was before. But they've also reminded me how far I am from being like them. Jackson set the papers aside and folded his arms. So, what are you going to do? The longer you wait, the harder it'll be for her to forgive you. Christian didn't answer immediately. He knew Jackson was right, but the thought of facing the fallout from his deception terrified him. Meanwhile, Heather spent much of that night deep in thought. She looked over the few letters she kept from her children, comparing them to James's actions. Though her children hadn't been unkind, their emotional distance hurt her more than any criticism. But James was different. He had been there, present in the small moments of her daily life, reminding her she could still make a difference in the world despite her age and circumstances. Now, however, that bond was tinged with uncertainty. Heather began to wonder if she had idealized James. Had her desire to see the best in people blinded her to an uncomfortable truth? Her children's harsh but honest words echoed in her mind. What do you really know about him? If you're listening to this and feel like Heather's kindness is being rewarded, leave a comment nougat to show your attitude. The dawn brought a sense of unease. Exhausted from a sleepless night, Christian decided it was time to face his truth. He couldn't keep hiding behind a false identity. He wanted to be honest with Heather, not just for her sake, but for his own. He had come to the village seeking answers about humanity and others, but what he found instead was a lesson about his own. Yet, as he made his way to Heather's house, doubts overwhelmed him again. What if revealing his true identity meant losing her forever? What if everything they had constructed collapsed in an instant? He stood frozen outside Heather's door, unable to knock. Meanwhile, inside her home, Heather kept glancing toward the square, hoping to catch sight of James in his usual spot. Though she couldn't quite explain it, an unshakable feeling lingered. Something was about to change. The tension in the air felt electric, as though the entire universe was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable to unfold. Both were entangled in their own inner turmoil, and the choices they made in the coming days would alter the course of their lives forever. That evening, the plaza in Cooperstown was unusually lively. All eyes and whispers were focused on the massive old oak tree, where James sat as always, though he seemed unusually deep in thought. From her stand selling herbs and fresh fruit, Heather watched him with a mix of curiosity and unease. Ever since Jackson had arrived, the atmosphere in the town had shifted, and Heather couldn't shake the feeling that something significant was on the horizon. It didn't take long for Jackson to appear. His stride was purposeful, drawing the attention of neighbors who stopped to watch. He stood out sharply among the town's modest simplicity, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit. Without hesitation, he headed straight for James, who visibly stiffened, as if bracing himself for a moment he had long anticipated with a blend of resignation and fear. "How much longer are you going to keep up this charade, Christian?" Jackson's voice was steady and loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. The name Christian echoed through the gathered crowd, causing a ripple of confusion. Heather, who had just arrived carrying a basket, froze mid-step. Her eyes darted toward James, who remained motionless, his head bowed as if unable to meet anyone's gaze. Jackson's words hung in the air, casting an awkward silence over the bystanders. "Christian," Heather managed to whisper, her voice trembling. She didn't understand what was happening, but her heart was already filling with doubt and an unfamiliar ache. James, or Christian as he was now called, rose slowly without saying a word. His face bore the weight of guilt and uncertainty. He glanced at Heather for just a moment, but in that brief look, filled with regret, she could tell there was more to the story. Without offering any explanations, Christian turned and began walking away from the plaza, leaving everyone in stunned silence. Jackson watched him leave with a heavy sigh before turning toward Heather, whose eyes brimmed with unanswered questions. "Mrs. Heather," Jackson said, stepping closer, "I think you deserve an explanation, but I'm not the one who should give it. Who is he? Why did you call him Christian?" Heather's voice cracked with pain as she asked, desperate for clarity. Jackson regarded her seriously, weighing how much to reveal. "I can't tell you everything, but Christian Warren isn't who he claims to be. Believe me, he has his reasons. I know this is hard to understand, but he's not a bad man," Jackson replied. Heather stood there, trying to make sense of his words, while the murmurs of the townspeople grew around her. She sensed a shift in the ground beneath her feet. The puzzle pieces she had been attempting to piece together about James were now more dispersed than before. That night, in the solitude of her home, Heather spent hours replaying every conversation, every gesture, and every glance she had shared with James. She was desperate to make sense of what had happened. Who was he really? Why had he come to the town under a false identity? What could he possibly gain from his deception? Though subtle, the betrayal cut deeply. She had trusted him, even defended his character in front of her own children. Now, it all felt like a cruel illusion. Meanwhile, Christian sat in his small rented room, grappling with his own inner turmoil. The public confrontation had left him exposed, and he knew there was no way to keep hiding from the truth. He spent hours staring at the ceiling, replaying the choices that had led him here. What had started as a social experiment to better understand the struggles of those with less than him had taken an unexpected turn. He had found something he never anticipated, a genuine connection with a woman whose kindness had broken down his defenses. Pacing the room, he knew he had to face Heather and tell her everything, even if it meant losing her forever. But fear kept him frozen. How could he possibly look her in the eye and explain that their relationship was built on a lie? Yet, Jackson's words echoed in his mind. "Every day you wait, you make yourself more vulnerable." He was right. The time had come to face the consequences of his choices. Close to midnight, Heather finally stopped the endless cycle of thoughts in her head. She sat by the window, gazing at the square. James's absence was a painful reminder of the bond that now felt shattered. Yet, deep in her heart, she wanted to understand. She needed to hear the truth directly from him, without rumors or interference. Meanwhile, the town was buzzing with speculation about James's true identity. Some claimed he was a fugitive. Others thought he was an eccentric millionaire. But Heather paid no attention to the gossip. She knew the only way to find clarity was to confront him herself. The uncertainty tore at her, yet it also strengthened her resolve. Something about his demeanor told her that, despite the lies, he wasn't a bad man. His eyes that afternoon, filled with remorse, remained etched in her memory. As the clock ticked through the night, both Heather and Christian prepared themselves in their separate corners for the inevitable confrontation. It was a moment they both knew would forever alter the course of their lives. Dawn broke over Cooperstown with a heavy atmosphere. Heather woke after a restless night, her heart weighed down with unanswered questions. The whispers about James, or Christian, as people now called him, echoed in her mind. Despite everything, Heather couldn't ignore her need for answers. She knew that the only way to ease the uncertainty was to face him directly. With determined steps, she headed toward the square. When she arrived, her heart sank. He wasn't there. The old oak tree, his usual spot, felt emptier than ever. For a moment, Heather thought her hope of finding closure might slip away. Then she saw Jackson standing by the fountain, as if waiting for her. "Good morning, Mrs. Heather," he greeted her politely, nodding slightly. Heather wasted no time on formalities. "Where is James?" she asked, her voice laden with emotion. "I need to speak with him." Jackson let out a deep sigh, as if he had been expecting this question. "He's not here. He needs some time to think, but I believe it's only fair that you know a little about what's going on." Heather's eyes locked onto him, waiting for an explanation. "Hector Warren is not a homeless man, Miss Heather. He's a businessman with a life completely different from what he's shown here. He came to this town for personal reasons that only he can explain, but I can assure you, he didn't come with bad intentions." Heather felt her heart sink. Jackson's words validated her deepest fears. James had been lying to her all along. "Why would he do something like this?" she asked, her voice trembling. "What's the point of deceiving someone in this way?" "It's more complicated than it seems," Jackson replied gently, his tone aiming to soothe. "I'm not justifying his actions, but what I can tell you is this. What he feels for you is real. He admires you deeply, Miss Heather. What started as an experiment has turned into something he didn't anticipate. You've changed something in him." Heather remained silent, trying to absorb what Jackson was saying. Part of her wanted to believe that James, or Christian, wasn't a bad man, but the betrayal of her trust left her deeply hurt. She felt that the bond they had built was now tainted by lies. "Where is he now?" she asked finally, her tone a mix of resignation and lingering hope. "I can't tell you where he is, but I know he wants to speak with you. He's trying to find the courage to do so." Heather nodded slowly, unsure whether she felt relief or greater pain. Jackson gave her a small nod and walked away, leaving her alone in the plaza. She stayed there for a while, staring at the old tree under which she had shared so many conversations with James. Each memory now carried a bitter-sweet sadness that seemed almost unbearable. Meanwhile, Christian sat in a small, simple room he had rented in the village since his arrival. He gazed out the window, watching the daily life of Cooperstown unfold. In his hands, he held a worn photograph of his family, a reminder of what he had lost in the past and what had driven him to start this social experiment. He reflected on everything that had happened since he came to the village. Initially, he had hoped to gain a fresh perspective on humanity and empathy. Instead, he found something far more profound, a genuine connection with Heather, a woman whose unyielding kindness had completely disarmed him. Yet he knew his deception had hurt the one person who had extended a hand to him without expecting anything in return. Christian spent hours contemplating how he could approach Heather and confess the truth. He knew the damage was done, but he couldn't move forward without being honest with her. Despite his overwhelming fear of losing her, his need to be truthful was even stronger. Heather deserved to hear everything, no embellishments, no excuses. At Heather's home, the afternoon passed slowly. Sitting in her favorite chair, she replayed every moment she had shared with James, struggling to reconcile the image she had of him with the truth she had just learned. Though she felt an overwhelming sadness, she also recognized that James's actions, despite the lies, had brought something positive into her life. Through him, she had rediscovered her own capacity for empathy and resilience. But that realization didn't make accepting the betrayal any easier. As night fell and the village settled into quiet, Heather made a decision. Even with her emotions in turmoil, she knew she needed to hear the truth directly from Christian. Not for him, but for her own sake. Heather needed answers to find her peace. Meanwhile, in his room, Christian reached his own resolution. He couldn't keep running away. It was time to face the consequences of his actions and show Heather that, even though everything had started with a lie, his feelings for her were real. Christian composed a letter, his final option, in the event that he was unable to articulate his feelings. He promised himself that the next day he would seek Heather out and tell her everything. As they both steeled themselves for what lay ahead, the atmosphere in Main Street seemed charged with a quiet anticipation. The decisions they were about to make would shape not only the future of their relationship, but also the lasting impact this encounter had on their lives. The day dawned with an unusual buzz of activity in Main Street Square. After days of uncertainty and reflection, Christian had decided to confront the truth. With Jackson's help, he organized a small gathering to bring the townspeople together. Word spread quickly that something important was about to happen, and curiosity drew everyone to the square. When Heather heard the rumors, she hesitated. Her heart was still torn between the hurt of feeling deceived and the hope of finding closure. After some thought, she decided she deserved to hear what Christian had to say. Draping a shawl over her shoulders, she walked slowly toward the square. As she arrived, she found the townspeople gathered in a semicircle near the old fountain. At the center stood Christian, alongside Jackson. His expression was calm, though his eyes betrayed a hint of nervousness. He was dressed simply, wearing a clean shirt and trousers that sharply contrasted with the persona of James he'd presented. Heather positioned herself quietly at the back of the crowd, watching him intently. Christian stepped forward and cleared his throat. The murmuring ceased, leaving a silence so profound it was almost tangible. With a voice steady yet filled with emotion, he began, "Good afternoon, everyone. Many of you know me as James, the man who's lived near the old fountain for the past few weeks. But today, I'm here to share the truth about my identity and the reason for my visit." The crowd exchanged glances, a mix of surprise and curiosity etched on their faces. Heather watched him closely, her heart pounding. Christian continued, "My real name is Christian Warren. I'm a businessman, the owner of a company that has given me more than I ever dreamed of. But some time ago, I began to feel like something was missing. I had success, but my life lacked meaning." He paused briefly, scanning the crowd. "So, I decided to conduct a personal experiment. I left my old life behind to immerse myself in the realities of those who face greater challenges. I wanted to understand how they live, how they face their struggles, and most importantly, how human kindness can thrive even in the toughest circumstances." The crowd murmured again, some expressing disbelief, while others tried to process his words. Christian's eyes shifted toward Heather, and his voice softened, tinged with emotion. "During my time here, I met someone who completely changed my perspective. Mrs. Heather, your kindness and generosity not only comforted me, but also showed me the true essence of humanity. You didn't judge me or ask what I could offer in return. You simply helped, selflessly and without hesitation." Heather felt her eyes well up with tears as she listened to his words. Christian's voice, now slower and filled with sincerity, carried an undeniable weight. "I can't even begin to thank you for what you did for me," he said. "You restored my faith in people. You helped me realize that, despite all my material possessions, I had nothing if I didn't understand the value of empathy and compassion." Christian reached into his pocket and pulled out an envelope, holding it carefully in his hands. "I want to give something back, even if it's just a small way to acknowledge the impact you've had on my life," he continued. "This envelope contains documents that transfer a significant sum in your name. It's enough to secure your future and, if you choose, to help others just as you helped me." The neighbors stood in stunned silence, absorbing the enormity of what they had just witnessed. Heather, visibly moved, stepped forward, but she didn't reach out to take the envelope. Instead, she locked eyes with Christian, searching for something deeper than his words. "Christian," she finally said, her voice steady yet gentle. I can't accept this, not out of gratitude or guilt. What I did for you wasn't done with any expectation of a reward. Helping you was an honest act, a reflection of what I believe we all should do for one another. If you see this as payment, then I'm afraid you've missed the message I tried to convey. Heather's words hung heavily in the air, and Christian, clearly taken aback, lowered his gaze. His hands trembled slightly as he held the envelope. I understand, Heather, he said after a moment of silence. But this isn't a payment or a debt. It's my way of trying to be better, to do something meaningful with what I've been given. You owe me nothing, but I owe you more than words can ever express. Heather took a deep breath and nodded. She stepped forward and gently took the envelope, tucking it into her shawl without opening it. I hope you've learned something more than just giving money, Christian, she said, her tone now warmer. I hope you remember that the most valuable actions are those that come from the heart, not the wallet. Christian nodded, visibly moved by her response. He then turned to the neighbors, who were still watching intently. To all of you, he said, his voice carrying across the square, thank you for allowing me to be here and be a part of this community, even if only for a short while. I leave this place with a lesson I will never forget. With those words, the gathering came to an end. Christian lingered in the plaza for a while, sharing brief conversations with a few neighbors who approached him. Heather, meanwhile, returned home, her emotions conflicted. Although the pain of betrayal didn't fade easily, something in Christian's words had touched her heart. That evening, as she sat weaving by the light of her lamp, Heather reflected on the events of the day. She knew the money alone wouldn't solve anything, but perhaps it could be used for something greater, something that reflected the values she had always stood for. Meanwhile, Christian left Main Street with the certainty that his life had been forever changed thanks to the most valuable lesson he had ever received. After Christian's profound revelation in the plaza, life in Main Street took on a new rhythm. Heather, though still processing everything that had happened, decided she couldn't remain trapped in the past. With the envelope Christian had given her, she realized she held a rare opportunity, not just to improve her own life, but to make a meaningful difference in her community. Her first step was to renew her home. That small house, which had borne witness to years of joy, sacrifice, and solitude, began its transformation. With the help of a few townspeople, Heather managed to fix the leaky roof that had been a problem during rainy days, paint the walls a cozy cream color, and expand her kitchen space. However, the most significant change was yet to come. Heather decided to turn part of her home into a community dining hall. She named it The Table for All, and the idea was simple: to create a space where no one felt alone or left out. Using some of the money she had received, Heather bought tables, chairs, and utensils, transforming her old patio into a welcoming area. Each week, with the support of volunteers, she prepared large pots of stews, rice, and freshly made tortillas. The aromas wafting from her kitchen soon became a beacon of hope for those in need. Word about the community dining hall spread quickly around town. At first, some neighbors, including Mrs. Betty and Mr. Harold, were skeptical. To them, helping others in such a way seemed impractical, even naive. But as they watched the steady stream of people coming to the dining hall, thanking Heather for a warm meal and a kind word, their perspectives began to shift. One morning, as Heather was sorting supplies in the pantry, Mrs. Betty appeared at the door. "Heather, I thought maybe I could help out today," she said with a shy smile, holding an apron in her hand. Heather looked up in surprise, but quickly returned her smile. "Of course, Betty. There's always something to do in this kitchen." Before long, Mr. Harold also joined as a volunteer, bringing sacks of rice and beans donated from his store. What had started as a small initiative, led by Heather, grew into a collective effort, showing how one act of kindness could inspire many. Meanwhile, Hector returned to his life in the city. His company's offices, once characterized by cold efficiency, began to transform under his new outlook. Hector no longer saw his business solely as a way to generate wealth, but as a tool for creating positive change. One of his first projects was establishing a fund to support underserved communities across the country. Using his company's resources, he financed the construction of schools, clinics, and community kitchens in remote areas. He also started visiting some of these communities in person, not as a businessman, but as someone ready to listen and learn. However, he harbored a deep affection for Cooperstown. Though he decided not to return to the town, he felt a deep connection to Heather. Every month he sent an anonymous, carefully written letter, thanking her for the lessons she had taught him. At first, Heather wasn't sure what to make of these letters, but over time, she began to anticipate them with a mix of gratitude and nostalgia. In one letter, Hector wrote, "Mrs. Heather, your dining hall doesn't just feed people. It reminds us that a single act of kindness can change lives. You changed mine. Thank you for being the example we all need." Heather kept the letters in a small wooden box alongside her other treasured memories. Although she never replied, each word Hector sent strengthened her belief that the choices she had made were the right ones. The impact of the community dining hall extended far beyond the town. People from nearby areas began visiting Cooperstown to see Heather's work, with some even offering donations and support. The dining hall, which had initially served only a handful of people, gradually evolved into a gathering place for the entire community. It became more than just a spot for meals. It turned into a haven for sharing stories, laughter, and dreams. Heather's children, Mike and Sandra, began visiting the village more often. Witnessing their mother's accomplishments, they felt an overwhelming sense of pride and humility. During one visit, Mike said, "Mum, I never realized how strong you are. You've done more for this town than I ever imagined." With a serene smile, Heather replied, "It's not about strength, my son. It's about listening to your heart and acting with faith." Sandra also started getting involved in the dining hall, organizing activities for the children who came with their families. Slowly, the bonds between them grew stronger, and Heather felt her home, now full of life and laughter, was finally whole again. Meanwhile, in the city, Christian continued with his projects, but often reflected on the profound impact Heather had on him. Though he knew he might never return to Cooperstown, he felt a deep connection to Heather that transcended physical distance. For her part, Heather carried on her work, knowing that Christian's influence lingered in every meal served and every smile shared. Rebuilding their lives, both Heather and Christian came to realize that true wealth lies not in material possessions, but in human connections and the transformative power of kindness. As the community dining hall remained a beacon of hope in Cooperstown, Heather and Christian understood their paths, though different, would always be intertwined by the lessons they had taught each other. Heather's dining hall had become a symbol of unity in the village. Each day, it was filled with children's laughter echoing through the tables, the aroma of freshly cooked meals, and the warmth of heartfelt conversations. At 70, Heather felt more alive than ever. Yet, deep in her heart, she held a special place for her children, Mike and Sandra, who remained an essential part of her life, despite the time and distance that had kept them apart. When Mike and Sandra learned about the success of the dining hall and how their mother had transformed not only her life, but also the lives of the villagers, they began to rethink their own priorities. To them, Heather had always been a figure of strength, but the magnitude of what she had achieved without their help filled them with both admiration and guilt. They knew their mother never blamed them, Yet they also understood that their absence had left a void they could no longer ignore. One afternoon, while Heather was organizing supplies at the dining hall, she heard the sound of a car pulling up in front of her house. Looking out the window, she saw Mike and Sandra stepping out, their hearts as heavy as the suitcases they carried. "Mom!" Sandra exclaimed, running to embrace her. Heather dropped what she was doing and walked outside to greet them. Her arms opened wide with the same warmth as always, embracing her children with a tenderness that erased the years and miles between them. "What a wonderful surprise," Heather said, tears welling up in her eyes. Mike, more reserved, gave her a firm hug, his gaze betraying the emotions he was holding back. "Mom, we came to stay with you for a few days. We want to help you with the dining hall if you'll let us," he said, almost pleading. Heather smiled gently and welcomed them inside. They sat around the table as she poured coffee, beginning a conversation they had needed for years. "I've been waiting for this moment for a long time," Heather said, passing the cups to her children. "But I don't want you to feel obligated to be here. I only want you to stay if it's truly what you want." Sandra reached out and took her mother's hand. "Mum, we know we've been distant. We've been so caught up in our own lives that we didn't realize what we were leaving behind. But we're here now because we want to be with you, not because we have to." Mike, ever the practical one, added, "I always thought that by giving you space, I was letting you live your life peacefully, always caught up in my own responsibilities. But I realize now that it only pushed me further away from you. You've done so much for us, Mum. It's time we do more for you." Heather listened quietly, her heart swelling with gratitude. Tears brimmed in her eyes, but her voice remained steady as she replied, "I hold no grudges. I've consistently upheld the principle of extending second chances, not only to unfamiliar individuals like James, but also to those I cherish. What matters is what we do from now on." The days that ensued were filled with a flurry of activity at the community kitchen. Mike and Sandra dove into every task, from cooking and serving meals to organizing games for the children. Mike, who worked in finance, started helping Heather manage donations and expenses more effectively, while Sandra, with her creative flair, painted vibrant murals on the walls that told stories of the town's history. "Is it always this intense?" Mike asked one afternoon after tackling a mountain of dishes. Heather erupted in laughter. "This is every day, son. But the joy of seeing those smiles and knowing we're making a difference makes it all worthwhile." Sandra, who was setting up an activity for the kids, came over and hugged her mother from behind. "You are truly extraordinary, Mom." "I'm certain no one else could have done something like this." Heather shook her head, smiling. "It's not just me. All of this is possible because of the people in this town who believe in kindness and the power of helping others. And now, it's thanks to you too." One evening, after closing up the kitchen, Heather and her children sat on the porch, enjoying the cool night air. Under the stars, Mike and Sandra opened up about their feelings. "I always thought you were fine, Mum," Mike said, gazing up at the sky. "But now I see I didn't do enough to be there for you. It feels like time stole something from us that we can never get back." Heather looked at him tenderly. "Time isn't lost, Mike. It's always there, waiting for us to make the most of it. And you're here now. That's what matters." Sandra, her eyes glistening with tears, added, "Seeing everything you've done for this town makes me so proud of you, Mum. But it also makes me wonder if we ever truly appreciated all you sacrificed for us." Heather clasped their hands tightly. "I never expected you to fully understand everything I've done for you. All I ever wanted was for you to be happy, to live fulfilling lives. And you've done that. Now, the only thing I ask is that we move forward together as a family." As the weeks went by, Mike and Sandra returned to their lives in the city, but kept a heartfelt promise. They would visit Heather often and stay connected. True to their word, they came back to the town every month to help out at the kitchen and spend time with their mother. Their relationship found a new balance, built on mutual understanding and a shared commitment to reclaiming lost time. Heather, on her end, found a renewed sense of peace, knowing she had not only transformed her community, but also mended the relationship with her children. In her home, once filled with quiet, now echoed the laughter and conversations of Mike and Sandra. The community dining hall remained a hub of connection, but for Heather, the greatest gift was having her family close again, stronger than ever. Time in Cooperstown moved gently, like a soft breeze brushing over the fields, carrying away the memories of harder days and making room for fresh beginnings. The story of Heather and Christian became a source of pride for the townsfolk, a tale shared as an example of how a single act of kindness could surpass all expectations. The community dining hall, affectionately called the table for everyone, grew beyond Heather's initial dreams. Donations continued to pour in, and with the unwavering support of local volunteers, the space evolved into a gathering spot for the entire town. It became much more than a place to share warm meals. It offered sewing workshops, adult literacy classes, and recreational activities for children. Though always modest, Heather couldn't help but feel a sense of pride when she saw how her humble project had touched so many lives. One afternoon, Betty, one of the most active volunteers, remarked while chopping vegetables in the kitchen, "Heather, I never imagined our town could change so much. Do you realize what you've accomplished here?" Heather, busy kneading tortillas, looked up with a gentle smile and replied, "I haven't done this alone, Betty. All of you made this happen. This place is a reflection of what we can achieve when we come together." Inspired by Heather's example, the people of Cooperstown began to take action. Mr. Harold, the owner of the local shop, started a barter program, allowing struggling families to obtain essential goods without worrying about money. Others joined forces to repair the town's streets and paint colorful murals on the faded walls. Cooperstown gradually transformed from a forgotten place to a beacon of unity and resilience. Meanwhile, in the city, Christian Warren continued his life with a renewed purpose. Though his time in Cooperstown was behind him, the experience as James became the driving force behind his philanthropic efforts. From the comfort of his office, Christian funded initiatives to build homes, provide educational opportunities, and establish dining halls like Heather's in rural communities. On quiet evenings at home, he often found himself thinking of Heather. Her image, her voice, and her strength remained vivid in his memory. Although he never returned to the town, he kept writing her letters to make sure she knew how deeply he admired her. Christian saw Heather as the kindness he had been longing for, the guiding compass that had reshaped his life. In one of those letters he wrote, "Thank you, Heather, for teaching me that true wealth isn't found in what we own, but in what we give. Even if our paths never cross again, I will always carry with me the most valuable lesson you gave me, that a single heart can change the world." Heather kept every letter in a small wooden box, reading each one with heartfelt gratitude. Though she never replied, she felt a deep sense of connection, knowing Christian had found his purpose and that their lives remained intertwined in some unseen way. Heather's impact stretched far beyond her little town. People from nearby communities began visiting her Table for All to learn how to recreate its success in their own areas. Heather always welcomed them with a warm smile and a fresh cup of coffee, openly sharing her experiences and advice. One day, a group of college students arrived in Cooperstown to document the story of her dining hall and its influence on the community. At first, Heather was shy in front of the cameras and their many questions, but she soon agreed to share her journey. She spoke of how everything began with a simple act of faith, a piece of bread shared with a man under a tree. Kindness doesn't require grand gestures, Heather told the cameras. It only needs sincerity. A small act can grow into something far greater than we imagine. The documentary, titled An Open Heart, was showcased at various festivals, inspiring countless viewers who were searching for ways to bring positive change to their own communities. As the years passed, Heather leaned more on Mike and Sandra to run the dining hall, yet she remained its guiding spirit. Her children, who were now more involved in her life, couldn't have been prouder of what she had accomplished. Mike, with his financial expertise, helped expand the reach of the dining hall, while Sandra organized local events to raise funds. One evening, as Heather sat knitting by the fire, Sandra joined her. "Mom," she began softly, "I've been thinking about everything you built here. Did you ever imagine it would become what it is now?" Admiration filled her voice. Heather smiled, her eyes glimmering with years of cherished memories. "I never planned for this, my dear," Heather replied. "I simply followed my intuition, and opportunities started to present themselves." Sometimes, change starts with something as small as a conversation, a smile, or a meal shared. Sandra reached for her mother's hand, squeezing it gently. "Thank you for teaching us that, Mum," Sandra said warmly. "Thank you for showing us how to be better." Though Heather never saw Christian again, they both lived with the quiet assurance that their paths had crossed for a reason. Heather's community dining hall and Christian's philanthropic projects became enduring symbols of how acts of kindness transform lives, not just for those who receive, but also for those who give. And so, Heather and Christian's story became a lasting legacy, transcending time and place. Each meal served at the dining hall, and every school Christian built, stood as proof that a small act of kindness can truly change the world, beginning with a single heart. If this film touches your heart, leave your mark with a like. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel to explore more meaningful stories with us. Share your feelings with us and tell us your own stories. Every word you share is a building block that helps create our strong and enduring community. Together, we'll create a warm space where everyone can share and connect. Finally, don't miss the incredible stories coming your way soon. We're always here to bring you the best selections, full of deep values, yet entertaining. See you there.